Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast. We're in a kind of a funny period right now in 2021 in the Biden presidency. Uh, Joe Biden is abroad. I think he left yesterday on this foreign trip, if I have that right. So and I think that's the first foreign trip, at least the first extensive one. And that gets a president, that's a standard presidenting thing to do, something they tend to like to do, that it puts them, uniquely in charge. And courtesy of America, they're a big cheese abroad, even when occasionally they're only a medium cheese at home. So that's going ahead, and yet we have had a number of, what are for most Democrats, some pretty negative, how can I put it, pretty negative developments, or things that seem very challenging, that have come into greater focus over the last couple weeks. The big one, of course, is Joe Manchin put out this op-ed over the weekend in his the main home state paper, basically saying he will not vote for S1 H1, and that's the For the People Act, the big democracy protection bill that Democrats are very focused on, to basically turn back the wave of voter suppression bills that are, moving through state houses around the country. There's also campaign finance reform stuff in there, and to me, what is in many ways perhaps the most important thing is redistricting reform, putting some limits on extreme gerrymandering. Myself, and I hesitate to say this because this will get me in a bunch of arguments. I have never seen campaign finance reform as really at all in the same universe of importance as these other things. People may differ. In any case, I think I made this point a month or so back, and one of the big activists on this issue got in touch with me and sort of explained why I was wrong and all this kind of stuff. But the one thing that person told me, which I think is pretty relevant, is that almost for no one is the campaign finance stuff the holdup on H1 S1. No one is saying like, oh yeah, we do all this other stuff, but we can't manage the campaign finance stuff. I think, back in the earlier iteration with Joe Manchin, when he was still kind of open to voting for some version of the For the People Act, the campaign finance stuff was actually stuff he was pretty in favor of. I mean, it kind of it appeals to, in the old sense, we used to use the term, more kind of populist sensibilities, limits on very wealthy people, kind of having such a decisive hand in elections. Those to me, again, come under nice to have things, as opposed to critical to have. We have to we need to make sure that when we have congressional elections, House elections, although obviously it comes into play possibly with the electoral college too. We need to make sure that by and large, when you get the most votes, you win. And we're not in that we're not in that universe right now. We have a bunch of states in the Midwest that consistently, albeit sometimes very closely, vote for the Democrats in most elections, state legislative elections, presidential elections, Senate elections. I'm thinking of like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, those states, states that Trump won in 2016, but Democrats won again in 2020. All that happens, and yet their state legislatures are totally dominated by Republicans. It's particularly extreme in Wisconsin, where I don't have the I don't remember the exact numbers, but basically in state legislative elections, in terms of the overall vote, Democrats have done fairly well, reasonably well in recent years, and yet the Republicans either have majorities or super majorities. And so, and that obviously determines drawing the federal congressional district lines. So that is a basic structural thing about whether your vote counts, whether it matters. There's the campaign finance stuff. Then there's whether you can vote, right? Is it do they make it too hard for a lot of people to vote? Then there's does it even matter? And the does it even matter is a pretty key one too. In any case, Joe Manchin put out this basically saying he's not voting for it, and he justified that with a pretty one of these pretty tortured logics of not saying, well, I don't think, you know, state control, not federal control, or this or that. He basically just said you have to do it on a bipartisan basis. He even said this kind of what really had to stick it to a lot of Democrats is saying, well, this is just for partisan advantage. Well, kind of, but Democrats are just trying to make sure that the votes are counted. And like if yeah, I mean that may advantage Democrats, but that's a good thing in general, even if it does advantage one side. So, but basically, what he seemed to be saying is, voting rights are super important. So we need to make sure we're cooperating with the people who are attacking voting rights to protect voting rights. I mean, that makes no sense. And that, I think, is what is so exasperating for a lot of Democrats. It's hard to know where you go with that. It's hard to know the basis on which you try to come to some meeting of the minds, not with Republicans, but with Joe Manchin. When that is what he's putting out there, he has for a while been saying that in place of the For the People Act, we need to do what's now generally called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is kind of the upgrade of the Voting Rights Act, bringing back what the Supreme Court tossed out a few years ago. And that's actually really important. That is also really important. The voting rights types say they're both important, and they both do complementary and very important things. So you can't substitute one for the other. That doesn't make any sense. The problem with that is that Manchin has pitched that as something where both parties can come together. But in fact, there's only one Republican who supports it, Lisa Murkowski. And like maybe Susan Collins might get on board. But the point is, it's as much if you are playing under the 60 vote filibuster rules, it's just as dead as the For the People Act. So in addition to the frustration that Democrats are experiencing of seemingly facing a brick wall before them in the way of passing legislation that they see as very important, the logic is also seems a little nonsensical. And again, things don't have to make sense to you. That's not a promise you get in life. But in this case, what makes it difficult again is that where do you start bargaining? It'd be one thing if you said, I can't go for this, this, and this. And then you say, well, come on, man, you got to give us something, and or maybe can we change something around? Again, it's not that. It's that Manchin, at least on its face, is insisting that Democrats need to get the cooperation of the people who are trying to make voting harder, to pass a law that will make it harder for them to make it harder. It makes no sense. So he said that. He also kind of, implied that he may not go for the 50 vote rules under the reconciliation system for an infrastructure bill. Now, he didn't say that categorically. He kind of, oh, I don't know. We got to see. We got to all this kind of stuff. So that has bummed a lot of Democrats out. I wrote a few pieces about this toward end of last week into this week, kind of saying what are we doing here? What's the plan? Is there it I have mentioned now many times this kind of era of opacity idea, that the key things we don't we have no visibility into. The key thing being like, does Biden and Manchin have some kind of understanding that he's going to be there at the end of the day, at least on infrastructure? So all those things are kind of happening, and it's my concern is, even if you assume that Manchin, kind of has some sort of at least loose understanding with people at the White House with the president, people can get pretty demoralized in the interim. And you're starting to see that happening. And I was talking to someone over the weekend who is very, very high level, on these things, kind of very tight in the decision making process, and saying that, yeah, there's markup and it takes a while to kind of write the bill and there's all these processes, all true. That is how laws are written. How they are passed is political and electoral. You need to have momentum. You need to have the support of your partisans. And I do fear a bit that that the people kind of making the decisions here may not totally get that part of the dynamic. In any case, so we have all that. We have that Kate is going to tell us a little more about that. They're starting to kind of roll through all these votes in the Senate. They're going to bring up all the things that Republicans are saying they will filibuster. They will not allow to go to a vote. And that is also supposed to kind of, bring this all to a head. What's going to happen? So that is happening. And the one other part of the mix, sort of expected and yet also a pretty big deal, is that yesterday President Biden notified Senator Capito of West Virginia, who maybe not coincidentally is Manchin's West Virginia Senate colleague, saying, you know what, these negotiations we're doing, these bipartisan negotiations over infrastructure, it's not working out. I'm not sure you get to like, it's not me, it's you. It's not working out, right? And so we're done. And Capito put out a statement, basically, very disappointed, but still, kind of some kind words towards the president, saying, "Oh, too bad," blah 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 blah. But that's done. They're no longer doing that negotiation, at least that one. And one of the things that we knew that came out, I believe it was in Capito's statement, is that she said, we Republicans made clear that any revision of the Trump corporate tax cut is a red line for us. We can't do that. And the president kept coming back and saying, well, this corporate tax hike. And that, this gets back to, what are we doing? What are we talking about when we talk about these bipartisan negotiations? It just makes no sense that the president is going to give up something that is overwhelmingly supported by his party, that is necessary to pay for really anything of substantial size. That can't be a red line when Republicans are probably not bringing more than a few people to the vote, and Democrats can do this with 50 votes. I talked about it in a post about this on Friday. The incentives are all wrong. Republicans don't want to spend this much money, A. They also don't want Biden to succeed as president. And we talk a lot about think about the country. Look, partisans always have that tension. They don't want to spend the money. They don't want to give Biden a success. So what is the incentives here? There are none. So that's done. And now we are getting into, we're getting kind of the main event here about whether what the Biden legislative agenda, what the record is going to be. We're gonna talk in a moment. Talk a lot about Joe Manchin. I did get a few of your emails over the last couple days, and keep sending them in. I've been asking people to kind of share their thoughts, both just you out in the country, and also people who are up on Capitol Hill or in the White House, kind of more inside word. But a few of you mentioned, Joe Manchin's been all over the place. He was totally for the filibuster. Then he was open to making it more painful and reforming it. And then he was back for defending it at all costs. And he wants a really big infrastructure bill, but he'll only support it if it has Republican support, and they're stuck at around like $200 billion. They have these kind of fancy arithmetic to say it's closer to a billion, but it's not, and they're paying for it by clawing back COVID money. So anyway, we're gonna get into all that pretty frustrating stuff. But before we do, we can talk a little about happier things, which is Grady's Cold Brew Ice Coffee, sponsor of this podcast. Summer, we got frisbee and barbecues and picnics, all sorts of fun stuff like that. And you also have iced coffee. You bring in the summertime with Grady's New Orleans style cold brew kit. You just add water to the reusable store and pour pouch and brew overnight for velvety smooth coffee. You can drink iced or hot. You can bring it to the park, camping, do anything you want. All sorts of, this is what all. They have some words for it that don't really quite go with the ad copy, but this is like the post-COVID summer. A
Hmm.
lot of terrible stuff still happening, but for a lot of us, we're vaccinated. Case rates are going down. We can finally, not only kind of, meet friends at the park, kind of 10 feet apart. You go to restaurants. It's everybody wants to get back to that, and you want to make Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee a part of that. So you do all those things because it's summer and you're allowed to do that kind of stuff. So if you're ready to give it a swirl, get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. So, Kate, what is going on?
So I guess we'll start with the collapse of the infrastructure negotiations, which to some degree was pretty predictable. They were billions of dollars apart throughout. Biden came down about $1 trillion from his original offer. The Republicans only ever came up, 100, 200 billion. There was just always this fundamental mismatch, which kind of, is so jarring when you hear Manchin insist that things be bipartisan kind of for the sake of being bipartisan, because you look at these infrastructure negotiations and it's not a matter of kind of bipartisan versus partisan as much as it is Democrats want a really big package and Republicans want a small package, and there's just that those are the facts. Those were the facts at the beginning. You can negotiate as much as you want. That's kind of the ultimate dynamic here. So now Biden's moving on to negotiate with they're calling themselves the G20, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats. The effort is being led by Kirsten Sinema and Rob Portman. Though, like you say, Mitt Romney, who's part of the group, has already said unequivocally that all tax hikes are off the table. So they're kind of just repurposing the pay fors established by the Capito group, which is user fees, repurposing COVID funds, which seems to be kind of a question mark of exactly how much of those there are. And, the part that makes me want to uh, tear my hair out, which is a tax on electric vehicles, though a carbon tax is totally off the table because
Yeah, I don't know.
that's definitely the direction we
Yeah,
should be going.
I don't understand what I mean. That just seems ludicrous. We're talking
Yep.
about the real debate is how much you subsidize electric cars, and it's not even like you're it's going to be a non-starter for a lot of people if you say, all right, we're outlawing coal, or or kind of something that hits a particular um business group or regional economy or something like that. I mean, I don't think uh, people are not against electric cars. They may not want to be forced too quickly to start using them, but people aren't against electric cars. And there's actually the I'm sure this is the same with companies abroad, but the U.S. car makers, particularly, I think especially GM, but Ford too, are getting really aggressive and basically saying, kind of like, putting numbers out there where in the next decade or so, or 10 or 15 years, they're not going to be making any internal combustion engine cars. So why you attack it's weird. But let me ask you this, Kate. Why why do this new negotiate? Like, what is it's especially if you're if you're negotiating with the same people basically.
Yeah.
I mean, you may not literally, but neither of these groups are going to are going to actually cut a deal without Mitch McConnell's approval. So at the end of the day, you're negotiating with the Republican caucus and Mitch McConnell, who is speaking for the Republican caucus. So what's the point? I don't even know why that would be happening.
Yeah, I did just want to say on the electric vehicle thing, it's like this Republican vindictiveness towards these extremely modest steps towards, a greener society. It is always so encapsulated for me by this one anecdote that Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House and then Reagan got into office and immediately took them down. Like that's just the kind of
Yeah,
the Republican attitude towards, green energy efficient things in general. But yeah, I think on this new group, in part, you just have to think they know it's a charade. We know it's a charade, which means it's all being done in the service of showing Mancha and that he's making, a real effort. But the question that keeps coming up from that is what's enough for him?
yeah.
And then also you have there is kind of increasing bullishness on the reconciliation piece of this. I was up on the Hill yesterday, and Bernie Sanders was kind of telling a group of us that he thinks they'll start moving on reconciliation in July, and he expects that to include both the American Jobs and Families Act, which is physical infrastructure, human infrastructure, the total of which right now is about $4 trillion. And Schumer's been kind of pressing that way as well. So that makes me wonder to some degree if maybe they're going to be willing to kind of make some kind of small plan with this bipartisan group and get as many democratic priorities in as possible, but in a way that's kind of not a ton of skin off their back, because then they can bundle the rest into reconciliation. So maybe that's a way of showing Manchin, we agreed on everything there is to be agreed upon. um, but they wouldn't give us things that we think are very important, so we also are doing reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that kind of concerns me is that um, pretty much all this stuff is important, but things have varying levels of popularity. So I worry that you get into a situation where the Republicans say, "Ah, yeah, we're in for the popular stuff," and then you
Totally.
guys carry the the more wobbly stuff on your own. Well, that's that's not great. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, if you're talking about the future of the country over the next decade, when the period of time over which this money will be spent, and then the sort of the transformative effect over decades into the future, you know who gets credit in the short term is not a deal breaker. But I do think that is that's worth considering. The other thing, and this is certainly what I heard from people who I think are pretty close to this process, and to them, these basically, Congress is back now. They're going to start marking this up in the House, which is to say, actually writing a bill.
Mhm.
The president puts out, I want to spend this much on this and this much on that, and kind of broad strokes what you're talking about, some dollar totals and stuff. But what's been conveyed to me by a lot of people, and this is true, with the Relief Act, in almost every case, you were talking about just pouring money into existing programs. So, in a legislative sense, that's pretty simple. It's appropriating a bunch of money. There's not much to do in terms of kind of standing up new programs, and that what we're calling infrastructure here is a bunch of totally new programs that don't exist and have to be created, have to be written. And as we've seen with the Affordable Care Act and stuff like this, that takes a while. And those folks basically saying, look, we're going to get back at the beginning of June. We're going to start writing the bill in the House. That'll take a month or so. Then we'll send it over to the Senate, and that's just going on. And this kind of negotiation stuff can be happening at the same time. It's not slowing us down. So who cares, right? And I guess I guess that's true. And if it makes Joe Manchin feel happy and all that kind of stuff, great. Um, and hopefully though, you're gonna hit a crunch point where you got to make a decision. And I think the assumption is that the the Democratic caucus in the House is going to write a bill. The Senate, House Democrats, Senate Democrats may fiddle here and there, and they may need to, much as it was the case with the Relief Act. Joe Manchin did throw a few wrenches in at the end. He wouldn't support what needed to be done to get the minimum wage in there. He kind of did a couple little things on the margins, but he voted for it. And I guess the message is that we're going to have to slog through this summer, do that work, and at the end, we'll probably have a big infrastructure bill. Let's hope so.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the big concern about going through these negotiating motions or, charade has always been there's such a limited window to legislate during this first term because, as we've said a lot on the pod, you only get about a year before people are going to go campaign. It gives you a short window for kind of the ambitious legislative slate that Biden and the Democrats want to do. But, as reiterated by Manchin on Sunday, he has no plans to touch the legislative filibuster, which basically takes that entire legislative agenda off the table anyway. So, in that kind of depressing way, time might not be as much of an issue. But as you say, there's also Schumer's kind of starting this dual assault while these negotiations are going on infrastructure, where he's bringing a series of popular, hard to argue against on its face bills to the floor, the plan being Republicans are going to filibuster all of them. And the hope is that the accumulation of obstruction and frustration will be enough to prod Manchin, Sinema, the few others who like the filibuster to gut it once and for all. Now, of course, the big crescendo to that effort was planned to be S1, the For the People Act, the sweeping democracy reforms package, which Democrats have marketed as kind of this crucial safety net in light of Republican state legislatures doing all they can to make it harder to vote, which, as you said in the intro, Manchin officially came out against on Sunday with this just completely kind of nutso logic of saying, I want to do the John Lewis Voting Act instead. Great. That's got one Republican attached to it. You're not going to get 9 others. And as you say, the two bills are not interchangeable. The John Lewis Voting Act is not just kind of a smaller version of S1. They do fundamentally different things. So where we're kind of standing now is Schumer last night brought the fair or the paycheck. I'm forgetting
Paycheck
his name
fairness?
now.
Is it
Yeah,
paycheck fairness
Paycheck
or
Fairness
paycheck?
Act.
Right, right,
That's it.
right.
Meant to, help eliminate the gender pay gap. So that came to the floor last night, and Republicans filibustered it. It was 49-50 because Gillibrand wasn't there. But the thing that kind of was weird to me about that is I totally get the logic of the induce filibuster after filibuster after filibuster. And I think that's a smart way to do it. I don't get doing it totally under the radar. I mean, that filibuster kind of went off with a whimper. There wasn't
Yeah,
any attention given it.
I was a little I was a little confused about that because not only did it not get a lot of attention, they generally take a long time. But I guess maybe I mean, long time, a few days. It's not something. It's not, for those who aren't as familiar with the Senate process. It's not that they call a roll call vote and that's it. There's talking and this, but I guess the
Hmm.
point is that in this case, if Republicans have no maybe interest in drawing it out, it is fairly quick. But yeah, it was under the radar, and I guess this is something that maybe Democrats need to think a little bit more about how you sort of stage manage this. That press attention will just naturally and understandably not be that great when you're 100% clear that it's going to be filibustered and not go anywhere. And so they may need to do a little better there, because yeah, I didn't even know it had already happened. I mean, I knew it was first up. I know it was happening. I didn't know it was done.
Right. And I mean, I think on the press piece, it's also, they as Senate leaders should be talking about it more. I was on the Hill yesterday, and Schumer's floor speech, the first two-thirds of it were not about that. It was about the Chinese competitive bill, which passed last night, which I know he helped write, and he's proud of it, and he's excited that it got passed with bipartisan support. But if the idea here is to maximize the pain of the filibuster and to make Republicans look as bad as possible for opposing broadly popular, hard to argue with legislation such as eliminating the gender pay gap, don't you want to shout that from the rooftops and just make it painful, 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 especially because Manchin was an original co sponsor of this bill. It was clearly targeted to hit him where it hurts.
Hmm.
And it just kind of went off with a whimper. And then Manchin was like, yeah, I'm disappointed, but I'm going to keep working for pay equity in the United States. And that's that. And so I think it's a good idea. I think they got to ramp up the pressure campaign. I think you got to call Manchin on his bluff instead of kind of tiptoeing around so as not to anger him. But it's beyond me why you just kind of let it happen in the middle of the night with absolutely no fanfare.
Yeah, that is kind of weird. And the other thing again, and if you're getting tired of me saying that Joe Manchin is illogical, believe me, I'm getting tired of it. I'm getting tired of my saying it. Right? I'm getting it's what is the point of saying the same thing over and over again? But if you'll allow me one more opportunity, this illustrates one of the strange things about this. In policy terms, everybody's talking about Joe Manchin is the most conservative Democrat in the caucus. Well, that may be true, but he's not very conservative. He's got a regional thing with coal that we know about, right? And guns are a big issue in his state. He's not, uh, but on a lot of these issues, pay equity, it has been for many years fairly controversial. Not in the abstract, but what government does to sort of force the matter. And he's right there. He's a co-sponsor, right? He's not there like, oh, there's got to be more free market or something like this. And he's kind of the same on the infrastructure bill. So it would be a little more straightforward if he were clearly more conservative. But at least in policy terms, he's not.
Well, and I think the thing that's so frustrating about him is that he won't spell out any policy his issues. He won't spell them out in any specific way. He just keeps saying, "I want things to be bipartisan," without talking about what part of the bills he thinks is too partisan to operate. And I think that really frustrates people, especially on S1, because he wrote that op-ed we talked about and said this is too partisan of a bill, but wouldn't talk about which pieces of it he opposes and why he likes the John Lewis Act better. So it makes it very hard to craft a legislative agenda around the whims of Joe Manchin when nobody, including possibly him, knows what those whims are in any specific way other than kind of an obsession with being seen as bipartisan.
Well, I think that's he did kind of go there for the first time with that op-ed in as much as that he said the bill is too partisan. But broadly speaking, he has actually been pretty clear, if kind of a bit nonsensical, because like I had one of our readers email me and said, has anybody kind of buttonholed Manchin and said, okay, what are the issues, what are the specific issues, right, that are either you got to have or you refuse to have. And really he's been pretty clear with most of these bills. He's not that picky, you know. They're fine for him, and he could go this way or that way. He is pretty much exclusively defining bipartisanship as when Republicans agree to vote for it. So he's not even saying kind of like, look, don't make it impossible for them. You know, don't do this or don't do that. It is pretty much purely a the definition is when Republicans vote for it. And as we've said, that is something, you know, in everything you do in life, in or certainly when any kind of contest is happening, you maintain the initiative. You try to you can't control whether you win, but you try to control the process. Well, obviously the Democrats have no input on when Republicans will decide they want to vote for something to help the Democrats. I mean, probably it'll just never happen. Anything that is defined in it, particularly important. Um, and that as you say, Kate, makes it's just very hard to know where you grab on because there are no specifics. And he's being clear. He's actually being very clear. He's just not making a lot of sense. He is saying, get back to me when you have 10 Republicans. That's clear enough. But how you do that is not clear. How he's going to help get it done is not clear. And especially because Republicans don't want Joe Biden to succeed as president.
Right, which is the fundamental thing that is most confusing to me about Manchin. Because when he started out the term, he said multiple times his biggest priority was Joe Biden having a successful presidency. That is just at odds with what he's saying now. And I don't believe that he doesn't know it, even if the fundamental answer to all of our kind of crystal ball reading about Manchin is he's just like not that smart of a person. Even if that is the correct conclusion, he knows those two things are at odds. So either
Yeah,
he's prioritizing something above Joe Biden having a successful presidency or, something else is going on here.
again, another thing, and this is where I get all my wisdom from, is from your emails. Uh, you know, wisdom such as it is, uh, is that he's really been all over the place. And so we don't have to say like, is he smart or not, but kind of like he's been totally inconsistent. And he is now, I think the counter to this is that his trajectory has been tightening, not loosening in his, kind of strictures in his inflexibility. But he's been all over the place. And I'm kind of persuaded that these things that he's saying absolutely never positively ever ever ever, you know, maybe today, maybe next week. I'm not saying I'm kind of betting on him deciding to reform the filibuster, but he's really been all over the place. So, make of that what you will.
Yeah. So we're going to keep talking about the future of the term, but I think we got a couple questions that kind of help shape that conversation. So our first one is from Jeffrey, who says, since the filibuster effectively kills the Democrats' ability to legislate, should they return to investigation not only of January 6th, but also the broader corruption in the previous administration? I recall Josh being somewhat lukewarm on the second impeachment because he thought COVID relief was a higher congressional priority. If other legislation is basically pointless now, what other power does the Democratic majority have, and how should they use it? So I think there are a couple kind of interesting questions bottled into here, but the piece that I've been thinking the most about, I think, is what are the downsides for Democrats to kind of be retroactive looking back on the Trump administration, given that they can't really do anything else while Manchin is in this posture. And that right now, any legislating past infrastructure seems pretty remote. Um, and while I kind of like the idea of having a historical record of this stuff, and I'm definitely a proponent for a January 6th commission, even one that's kind of disregarded by Republicans as partisan, because I do think it's important to get down for once and for all what happened, and I think that makes it harder for Republicans to kind of muddy the narrative. I do think there's a risk for Democrats to spend Biden's term just looking back and just kind of dealing with Trump and what he did. And the source of that for me is there was a report that came out a few days ago from three major Democratic interest groups that was an analysis of the last election, and it had recommendations about how Democrats can win going forward. And one of their major conclusions was that Democrats need to do a better job presenting an economic agenda, and that they lean too heavily on anti-Trump rhetoric rather than kind of creating their own brand in the last election cycle. And then that wasn't enough to pull every Democrat over the finish line. So I think inherent in that is the risk that if Democrats kind of, for good reason, just abandon attempts to legislate and spend all their time kind of, prosecuting Trump through whatever means available, they just risk going into the next election with the same thing, totally defining themselves as anti-Trump, which this kind of large, deep analysis found was just not enough. Which kind of makes me think, is that what they should spend the rest of the term doing if all legislating becomes impossible? Use what they have through what Biden can do unilaterally, what they can do through agencies, and just work on kind of creating a brand that they can carry into the midterms. Because if Manchin stands firm, if there's no legislating that's going to happen after infrastructure, Democrats' best hope at that point is to kind of turn back the historical tide, the precedent that they're going to lose seats, and just pour all their energy into maintaining and growing their majorities in these two chambers. Because otherwise, I'm not sure what's left. So I think, given that information, if legislating is totally off the table, I think you just got to do everything you can to use what legislation was passed to craft an economic message, especially to counter the Republican narrative that Democrats are the ones who caused the lockdown, that caused the economic devastation. Just like pour all your money into tailoring that message and crafting it so it's easily accepted by different groups, different states, different regions, etc. And then just go barreling into the midterms and just go whole hog into winning the biggest majorities you have. So next time, it's not Manchin who's deciding what the Democratic Party does, or worse, a Republican majority who's stymieing absolutely everything.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have been very forward leaning and very aggressive that we need to get to the bottom of really everything that happened in the Trump presidency. I think that's really critical. It is even more critical if he's going to be running for president against Joe Biden in 2024. Right? We need that kind of factual record out there. But even if he's not, we need it just to kind of clean the stables, as it were. But I really think it would be, if there is no legislating possible after an infrastructure bill, and again, I don't think we should take that totally for granted. If there's no more legislating possible, I think it would be disaster to just say, to go back to investigating Trump is going to be our whole thing. We should be doing that anyway, but that is not a message that takes the place of, what are you going to do to improve people's lives? What is the reason that people get enthused about voting for Democrats? What is the virtuous cycle between, I mobilize to vote for Democrats and get my friends to vote for Democrats and contribute money and volunteer for Democrats, because policy things are going to happen that are going to make things better, that are going to avert the worst of the climate catastrophe, that are going to make sure everything is no longer broken, that are going to make sure that people, working class people, are at least getting the basics insured to them. They have health care. They are not have higher minimum, all these kind of things. You have to do that. That has to be the thing. People political partisans are going to be going to want to hold Trump accountable for this, that, and the other. But that's not a message going into the future. And it's easy to kind of fall into a lot of kind of sappy campaign speech about elections are always about the future, but they are always about the future. They are. So I don't think that would be a good move. I think that if they cannot pass any more big legislation after, let's say there's infrastructure, but the other things you can't do, I think you shift into spending, a year plus talking about all the amazing things in the infrastructure bill, talking about all the amazing things um, in the COVID relief bill. One of the things about having a majority is you get to schedule the votes. So you start scheduling votes that are basically, hey, isn't it awesome that we got the vaccines all out in time bill? And isn't it awesome that that road got built near your house bill? You kind of you use you can use the legislative process to guide attention to things. You can also do you can do tons of stuff via executive order. And you're not going to win the midterms because you show that Trump sucked. Anybody with their eyes open knows he sucked and that he was a crook. You're going to have to be able to go into the midterm and say, look at all the stuff we got done. Do you want to go back to the other way? Do you want to get rid of the good stuff? Do you want to get rid of Obamacare? Blah, 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 blah. That is the only election the Democrats win. And so, and one thing I think that is really important to keep in mind is that if the Democrats pass an infrastructure bill of the scale, broadly in the scale that they are trying to, that will be a big fucking deal. That will it will unfold over a long period of time, but that will be transformative. People will see it. So a big thing you do, as Kate was saying, is you just talk about it constantly for the next year. And again, there's the way to see the 2022 election, and this has been from the case from the first day, is you are passing stuff, you are making people vote on stuff, you are talking about stuff, all queuing up to in November 2022, you make an argument to say, we made things better. Don't go back. We made things better. Don't go back. And really, we need more votes in the Senate, in the House, to make things even better. So anti-Trumps, I mean, look, no one is more anti-Trump than me. No one is more, he's got to be held accountable. We've got to get to the details. But that's not a message going forward. That is just critical work that you do regardless.
Yeah, and I think in some ways Democrats will benefit off the idea that Congress has been like pretty dysfunctional for a while. So there is good precedent for how to run for reelection when you haven't actually legislated that much. I mean, I think in some ways that's a page you can take out of the Republicans' book. They had all three branches under Trump, and all they essentially did was the tax cuts in 2017. So, and I think that's also a plus of having these like enormous bills that they're passing, both COVID relief and if they ultimately get what they want on infrastructure, that's a $4 trillion package that includes, hard infrastructure, bridges, roads, stuff, soft infrastructure. And so I think you can kind of break out all those individual things and act like they're all separate successes because to some degree they
They
are,
are. They
and
are.
American
Yeah.
people, I think, don't care or know if each piece of these giant bills were passed individually or together. I mean, that's plenty. That's plenty to make the case that says, look at all we did with these breathtakingly slim majorities.
Yep.
You help us out, you give us a few more senators, and we can do, the more progressive stuff. We can do the stuff that we really want to do.
And I'll say too, and again, Democrats, because they are so focused on the mechanisms, on both the mechanisms of government and the importance of government, have this real tendency to slip into, okay, now we're legislating and then later we're politicking. Well, everything you do over a 2-year congressional cycle is political. Everything. It should be. That's not a bad word. That doesn't mean you're not serious about legislating or governing, but the, everything is political. And not everything is passing new laws. As Kate just said, people don't care if they're like, well, infrastructure bill is only one thing. So you only get 1 point for that. It's actually a ton of things. And that's why it is, under an optimistic scenario, that's why it's taking so long. Because I had someone mention to me a couple days ago, this is like, creating 7 or 8 different programs to spend this stuff. It's a lot to spend $4 trillion. And again, it's not just pouring money into existing things. It's creating entirely new programs. So there is implementing that. There is talking about every single day you implement a new thing. It's politicking about substance. And again, to Kate's point, the fact that it may all become law in the late summer of 2021 doesn't mean there's not a ton more to do. I mean, it'll be really fucking hard to implement this stuff. We saw, even with Obamacare, that did relatively well. It was really hard. So I think we're down with no on that question. That is not the right thing to do.
Yeah. I do want to point out, I don't think neither of us are saying that's going to be easy for many reasons, including, as we've talked about, the precedent of heading into the midterms. I mean, it's not like a super rosy landscape for Democrats. Plus, Democrats tend to suck at messaging. But I think that's why this is like a really good opportunity to try to strengthen those muscles a little bit. And also, I mean, the bottom line, if Manchin is changing the filibuster off the table, it's all there is, basically. So, all right, let's move on to our second question. This is from Jordan. Everyone is frustrated and annoyed by Manchin, but my question is, at what point is the hurt he causes the Democratic Party more than the gain of having his seat? He's not contributing anything, and he's hurting the process. If the Democrats get one more seat, thus retaining the control of the agenda in the Senate, why wouldn't they primary him or remove the whip like they do in other parliamentary systems? I know it's not a thing done in the US, but he's hurting their case every day and always has. So I think the important thing in this question is that Jordan is making clear he's not advocating for removing Manchin before they get another seat. So, that's the most obvious knee-jerk reaction I had, is having Manchin means that, Schumer is the majority leader. He controls the floor. Democrats get the gavels on the committees. Democrats can nominate judges, so having him there just in a body in a seat who's a Democrat is important, aside from everything else that Manchin presents. And my reaction to this was kind of, I don't think it's necessarily bad for Democrats to have Manchin in a seat if they get more seats. Manchin, I think frustrations with him are very valid, but he has kind of come through for Democrats on big things, including, Affordable Care Act, COVID relief. He does tend to be there when they need him. So, and I think having a sometimes yes vote is better than an always no Republican vote, which is what would happen if Manchin was primaried, or even if he's not in the next election. Those are uphill odds. But I do think to some degree that frustrations with Manchin should be channeled into thinking about how he got into this ultra powerful position, which is that Democrats flubbed winnable races in
Yeah.
places like North Carolina
Yeah, like
or
tell it to Cal
Maine.
Cunningham, basically.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. Like,
yeah, yeah.
imagine if they had won. I still remember I wrote up the thing that was like, I separated into 3 tiers of these Senate races. The one that was like, Democrats should win these, basically. The next tier was Democrats could win these. And then the next was Democrats will win these if it's like a huge blue tsunami kind of thing. And Democrats didn't even win all the seats on that first tier, which I think, and I'm keeping in mind there are a lot of voting restrictions purposely put into place by Republicans. I don't argue with that. But based on the runoffs in Georgia, Democrats can win hard races when they pick good candidates and when they organize and when they tailor a message to that place. And that just didn't happen in that election cycle, which is why we're left with Manchin kind of controlling the party agenda. So I think that's a big part of what it kind of ties into what we were saying before is like going forward, the most important thing for Democrats to do is to get out of this situation in a way that gives them more seats, more of a buffer, and lessens Manchin's importance. And I think if that happened, if in 2022, say Democrats did pick up a couple seats, Manchin isn't going to be king of the Senate anymore. And I don't think his conservative ideals would bother people as much as they do right now.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, and I would say too. I mean, first of all, it's hard for me to get past the first point, and I don't think people fully get this. The mere fact that he makes Chuck Schumer majority leader is so important. It is impossible to overstate how important just that is. Everybody gets, if not for that, a lot of nominees don't even get a vote. Joe Biden would be negotiating with Mitch McConnell over what kind of person he could nominate to run the Justice Department. It would be a disaster, an absolute disaster. So that alone is just so huge. And even beyond nominations and confirmations, we talked about before, 2022 should be all test votes. Because we control what gets voted on. So just keep queuing up hard votes for Republicans as opposed to hard votes for Democrats. So I do think, again, I just think people underestimate how critical, how important that is to start with. The other thing is Joe Manchin, if he wanted to, he could become a Republican tomorrow. And I guarantee you, he would get he would go to Mitch McConnell and say, "Okay, I'll be a Republican. I want seniority. I want this. I want that," and they would give it all to him. So, I I think the answer again is no, and it's because of this that in the present, his role, even annoying the hell out of everybody, is such a godsend. You can't even describe it. And if you get three more votes, it's not like, oh, then you can ditch him. Why ditch him? It won't matter to ditch him. He won't be as important. There's just no um there's just no logic at any point to punishing him or trying to write him out of the party or primarying him or something like that. It's different if you might replace that person with someone better. I mean, that was the big thing back, 15 years ago with Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman was kind of, occupying this role in some ways in a more destructive way because he was often under undermining democratic ideological points in doing so. But the point was he's from Connecticut.
Right.
It's a super liberal state. Primarying him because there's just no, I mean, it's not impossible for a Republican to get elected from Connecticut, but pretty close, right? So there's just, look, Joe Manchin's driving me crazy, certainly, but that's a great seat to have that in some ways Democrats have no business having
Right.
because it is such a Republican state in national political terms. So no, there's never there's frankly never a point where it will be more trouble than it's worth to have Joe Manchin around. It's great that he's a Democrat. He's driving me nuts, maybe driving you nuts, but it would be far, far worse if he were a Republican. And frankly, if he got replaced by a Republican, he will not be replaced by a Democrat. It will not happen. If it turns out that if I heard that he wasn't running in 2024, I would do everything to say, like, Joe Manchin, please run again. We need you because not going to be replaced by another Democrat.
Right. I mean, and that's why I feel totally different about cinema. I think
Yeah.
she
She
will
is
and
the
should be
worst.
primaried
Yeah.
because her politics are more conservative than her states. As we've seen from Mark Kelly, who's serving at the same time, who's acting a lot more like you would expect someone from a purple state to act. So
Yeah.
there she could be replaced with someone who is closer to the center of the Democratic Party, and that's not like a stretch. Joe Manchin's the best we're going to do from a plus 39 Trump state.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I am so down on cinema. I can't think of any time I've been more down on any Democratic senator or representative. I will say though that it's not the same as Connecticut. That is still a state that has a Republican governor, Republican legislature. It's Democrats won it for president this time, but for the first time in like a quarter century. Or wait, did I don't think Obama won it. I think it was Clinton was last who won it. In any case, it's still pretty touch and go there. And I do think in a state like that where it's so touch and go, you have an acrimonious primary. There's a pretty decent shot you end up with a divided party and you lose the seat. So primarying her is not without risk by any stretch of the imagination. However, I it's a tough call, frankly. Um, but you do there are certain cases where you need to try to enforce some party discipline. And I really see her at this point as really kind of on an ego trip and acting as a troll. I really think that's what it is. I get that she definitely and rightly in Arizona wants to say, I'm not just another, kind of national Democrat. I'm different from that. And one thing that people don't remember, and that I think, and this is kind of what drives me crazy, but it's probably also to an extent what she's trying to live down. She was like the communications director for Nader in 2000. And she was way out there, both in her politics and in her kind of political self presentation for a long time. And I suspect, to the extent that you can put any logic to this, she's trying to live that down. She's trying to make clear she's not just like a little more mellow, a little more moderate. She's, that you don't remember that other person. But that also, I think, tells us pretty clearly this is all performative and this is all just like tactical. And it is not, it is way, way above and beyond any kind of, sort of self-preservation. So it's different with Manchin. Look, he's from a Republican state. It's amazing that he has won the races that he has, and pretty handily.
Yeah, and I think where I come from on the Arizona thing, because I agree with you. I mean, it's not California, it's not a slam dunk, but Mark Kelly won really handily. And granted, he probably has the most compelling personal story known to mankind, and that's not easily replicable. But he's not the only one. He's not the only one who's going to have a compelling story and be a good fit for the state. And I just think it would behoove Democrats to go out and see if they can find somebody else like that, because right now Cinema is acting more conservative than she deserves to be. And I think it's totally valid for the party to see if they can't do better. And I also think she's kind of at the point where she's probably pissed off so many Democrats in Arizona to begin with that I think it would be a hard sell to ask people to pound the pavement and knock doors for someone who's seen as kind of screwing over the party for no real reason repeatedly.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. Yeah,
so
we're totally in agreement. The only kind of slight hedge for me is that the process of primarying
yeah, no,
is
that's
pretty
fair.
chaotic and breaks a lot of china. There's zero question if you're starting from scratch. There's plenty of people who could win that race for the Democrats in a reasonable year. So it's a
Yeah,
tough one. Luckily, is she up in 24 or 26?
ugh, don't remember off the top.
I think it's 24 because they didn't have both Senate elections at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, so it must be she's up at the same time as Manchin, actually.
Yeah, and one last point I wanted to make on this is that just kind of an interesting side effect I think of the Democratic fury with Manchin and with Cinema is that the filibuster is becoming a litmus test for new Democratic candidates, which is interesting and good for Democrats. I think I saw um, Fetterman out of Pennsylvania, who's running for Senate there, put out a statement the other day saying that he'll always be the 51st vote. And I saw Connor Lamb, who's a moderate, who's considering a Senate run. He said that he is all for eliminating the filibuster. So that's kind of, for Democrats, I think, a happy byproduct of having these
And
obstinate
and
Republican or
that
Democrats.
is a big deal because I would say even in 2020, a lot of Senate Democrats were kind of like, well,
Yep.
we'll kind of look at it and blah. And even I relatively recently was kind of, do you really get rid of it totally? It makes it just like the House of Representatives, blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, to the extent that it is, because I keep hearing like, well, he's just, Manchin is taking the heat for these other people, whether it's like Angus King or, Dianne Feinstein, these other kind of, kind of laying low people who also don't want to do it. But what I've been telling people is like, trust me, if Manchin got on board and then those people had to say like, "Oh, I don't, I like the filibuster," man, they would be mowed down so quickly. They're staying quiet for a reason
Right.
because it is radioactive in Democratic politics.
Well, and I've also been working on a pretty intense filibuster tracker of people's opinions and how they've shifted. And we'll have something out on the website with some like cool graphic y type stuff at some
Interesting.
point soon. But I would say, with two exceptions, almost everybody who's had kind of statements in the past saying minority rights, I like the filibuster, almost everyone, including King, including Feinstein, has softened that position in recent months and said, okay, actually, maybe I'd be for some reform. So I'm not saying that the whole caucus is like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders,
Right.
let's get rid of it, let's eliminate it. But the vast, vast majority of the caucus has at least said they're down with some kind of reform to put the onus back on the minority and make it harder to use.
Yeah, I mean, and it is true. I mean, it has been clarifying because if you think about it in the context of new senators, if you're a John Fetterman or anybody around the country running for Senate, and if you could ask about the filibuster, you're saying, well, I kind of think it's important, man. Democrats be like, dude, what is the point?
Yep.
What is the point?
Yep.
Like the conversation ends,
No,
right?
I
Because
think 2020 is the last cycle you could get away with that.
yeah, there's no way because you have trained a generation of Democrats to say if you're not kind of totally down the line on 50 vote rules, why are we investing?
Right.
Why invest? And I will say this. I I haven't totally thought through. Even I am not opposed to some there is some logic in having the Senate move a bit slower than the House. And there are lots of ways, whether you want to call it a filibuster or not, that you you kind of you force a little more extended deliberation process. It certainly wouldn't be all I would ask for, but as I've said a few times on the pod, it would make a world of difference simply to make it an obligation of the minority to show up with 40 votes on a moment's notice, right? Not just that the majority has to have 60 votes, but kind of like Chuck Schumer can kind of look at the clock Friday night, say, all right, tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'm going to call a vote. Hope everybody can get there. Hope you can get 40 votes. But there's other things. There's sort of like, you could have it where it's 40 votes, and then after 6 weeks, it's 45 votes. You The key, and obviously people talk about having it as a talking filibuster. The key is it literally requires nothing, and it's unbounded, and that's just not workable. That is not workable at all. I think at this point, it's um, the the space for the kind of the slight, kind of reform, short of totally getting rid of it. I'm not sure there's even space for that anymore. It's been so discredited, rightly. Um, but yeah, 2020 was the last chance you got to have any equivocation on the filibuster if you were running as a Democrat. That's done.
Yep. Yep. I think that's right. Okay, we're running out of time here, but as Josh teased last episode, we do want to officially introduce our theme song competition to upgrade our current music with an original composition from one of our fans. So, real quick, here are the rules. The clip should run about a minute and a half, 2 minutes max. Should be high quality audio. We will pay for the winning submission. We ask for these compositions by the end of June. Send them to talk@talkingpointsmemo.com with podcast theme song competition in the subject line to help us pick it out from the inbox. And thank you to everyone who's already reached out to express interest. We're excited to hear what you come up with.
I would say too, like, and I don't want to constrain everybody's creativity too much, but I think in general, the kind of theme song we have right now, the kind of the bass, the bass line and everything, I kind of like that, right? I mean, there's one could imagine sort of a little more NPR ish, like kind of like little low energy. I don't think that's us, right? Or something. I like something kind of up tempo like that. So to the extent that that is, to the extent to kind of get your composer thoughts moving. But obviously, we don't want it to be identical. We don't want to just have one that no one else can use. But I just put that out there that I think that's a kind of a, I don't know, has some energy to it. What do you think, Kate?
Some high energy Jeb tunes.
Yeah, exactly, exactly, exactly. Do you come in with like a preference or a style or?
No, I don't know. I'm open. I want to see what the creative floodgates unleash here.
Yeah, and I would say too, don't think if that's not your, if that's not your style, there's no point. I mean, I think certainly very often the case for me and for many people that you don't know what you're going to like until you hear it,
Right.
right? And then you hear it and you're like, oh wow, that's great, that's exactly what we need to have. And yeah, and let's do it. And we'll I don't think we've discussed this yet, but we're not just going to kind of introduce it one day and say, oh yeah, that's the theme song, this person won it. We'll kind of get into it and
Yeah, it's going to
listen.
be
Yeah,
awesome.
we'll listen to different ones, get your feedback and everything. So it'll be a lot of fun, and we'll end up with a cool new theme song. So it'll be
Yeah.
awesome.
So remember, talk@talkingpointsmemo.com, home for theme song competition entries as well as questions. We got a ton this week and they were all really good. So
Yeah,
thank you for that.
yeah,
Keep them coming.
yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. I even wonder if there's like, I don't know. Maybe eventually we can find a way because we're generally doing a couple of them and we're getting way more. Maybe eventually we'll set up a part of the site where, I don't know, we publish the questions that we can't answer, and I don't know, just
Yeah,
there are a lot of them are just really interesting questions that we haven't, just time limitations haven't gotten around to,
totally.
but definitely keep them coming in. And remember that the Josh Marshall podcast is brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. If you're ready to give Grady's a try, you can get 25% off your first order at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's promo code TPM.
All right.
All right.
See you
Later.
next week.